Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. I'm going to wait a few minutes as folks join. But this is the FY24 SOAR Formula Consolidated Application Pre-Application Webinar. And this webinar will be recorded, and the recording will be shared to the SOAR Formula webpage by early next week at the latest. So you'll have that to reference, as well as the slides. We'll get started in about 1 more minute. All right, so again, welcome to the FY24 SOAR Act Formula Consolidated Application Pre-Application Webinar. My name is Brianna Griffin, and I'm the Manager for Federal Programs and Strategic Funding here at OSSI. As I mentioned, as folks were joining, this webinar will be recorded and shared to the SOAR Formula webpage along with the slides, so you will have that as a reference. And I'm also going to take this opportunity to recommend our new for FY24 application guide for this application. It is already posted on the SOAR Formula webpage, and the link to that was shared in the K-12 newsletter. It's a great resource, we think, for completing your applications this year, whether you're a new staff to your LEA or completing the application for the first time on behalf of your LEA, or if you're an experienced staff person as well. We think this will be a great resource for everyone and hopefully cut down on the amount of back and forth that we have to do throughout the application approval cycle. So let's get started. By the end of this presentation, we hope that you will understand the purposes of the SOAR Act Academic Quality and Early Childhood Grants and distinctions among their purposes, that you'll be prepared to complete and submit that application, including knowing what information should be gathered and prepared in advance, and understand the basics of project budgeting and allowable expenses. So again, we will go through grant details, the purposes of the SOAR Formula grants, a review of the application, how the application will be evaluated, important dates and contacts, and then we will have an opportunity for Q&A at the end. If questions come up throughout this webinar, please feel free to put them in the chat as you think of them, and we'll get to them at the end of the presentation. All right, so applications are available now in the EGMS system. You can follow that link to get there if you aren't familiar with the system, but I think many of you are. And then allocations were published on the OSSI website under the FY24 resources section on the SOAR Formula webpage. This is just a snapshot of what that document looks like. It includes every LEA's academic quality and/or early childhood allocation, along with their program contact. And contact information for each of those program contacts on the team is shared at the end of this presentation if you aren't sure how to get in touch with them. All right, so FY24 grant details. The award period for these grants will be from July 1st, 2023 through September 30th of 2024. And OSSI will allow for reimbursement of pre-award costs, so meaning costs that were obligated prior to the application being approved by OSSI, as long as they were not prior to July 1st, 2023. However, you do incur those pre-award costs at your own risk, meaning you will not be reimbursed if they aren't eventually approved as part of your application budget. And again, any pre-award costs must have been obligated no earlier than July 1st, 2023. Let's talk about the purposes of each grant. For the academic quality grant projects, this funding supports projects designed to have a direct impact on student achievement, either school-wide or for specific subgroups of students. And early childhood funding supports supplementary activities that support school readiness, including the development of literacy and mathematics skills for early childhood students. So as you are designing your projects, be aware of these purposes and make sure that your projects are aligning with those purposes, because that is something we will look for throughout the evaluation process. And then just some general notes on allowable uses. Grant activities should have a direct impact on student achievement and be supported by research and/or evidence. And all budget items must be supported by the needs assessment and be aligned with the proposed grant activities. So we are looking for a through line throughout your application between the needs assessment, proposed activities, and your budgeted expenditures. So for example, NWEA map software and data analysis support for teachers to improve data-driven instruction, that could be an allowable cost if it's aligned with your project and needs assessment. Similarly, extended day coordinator to provide training and support for staff to promote effective extended day programming is an example of an allowable cost. Again, as long as it is aligned with the needs assessment and project activities that you've outlined in your application. And for more examples of allowable uses, we do have an allowable uses reference document. So you can see kind of different categories of expenditures that might be allowable if they're aligned with your project. All right, so a review of the application. Some logistical notes. All applications, of course, must be submitted through EGMS. The deadline is 3 p.m. Eastern Time on Friday, November 3rd, 2023. The application will close at 3 p.m., so please do be aware of that time and date deadline. To avoid potential EGMS issues, which could prevent your LEA from submitting on time, we highly encourage you to submit at least 1 week prior to the deadline. We know that that is ambitious, so at a bare minimum, give yourself a day or two, because we have in the past had submission issues that have prevented LEAs from submitting on time. And contact your SOAR grant specialist if you have any questions, which again is listed in that allocations document that is also linked here. The application is built as a consolidated application, meaning it combines both the academic quality and early childhood grants. So you should review the allocation table to see which grants your LEA is eligible for. If your LEA is only eligible for the academic quality grant, which is the vast majority of LEAs, you will only need to complete that section, and you will not complete anything on the early childhood section of the application. And again, I'd like to plug our new application guide for this year. LEAs can use this guide to understand what specific details and information is required for each question and section of the application. We've provided a kind of brief highlights from the application guide in this presentation, but again, highly recommend whether you are new or experienced to download that guide and use it as you're completing your application. We do hope that it'll cut down on the back and forth and the number of times we have to send applications back for revisions. All right, so let's walk through the different sections of the application. So in the top right corner, there are going to be 3 application sections. The first that you'll see is the SOAR Formula Consolidated section, which has a number of tabs. There's an overview tab that you should read through, but has no information for you to actually enter in. And then you will enter in contact information on the second tab. Supporting documentation is not required for the initial submission, but is there if you would like to attach any supplementary materials. Please be sure to read through all the content and assurances on the assurances tab, carefully ensuring that your LEA understands what's legally required once the grant is awarded. And be sure to agree to all assurances on that assurances tab before attempting to save and submit your application. The remaining tabs provide reference information and don't require action, but you will return to this main section when everything else is done and you're going to finally submit to OSCE. The second section in that top right-hand corner drop-down menu is the academic quality application. So the information on the academic quality section, or the sections of the academic quality section, look almost identical to the early childhood section. So I'm going to go through some highlights of the academic quality application and just know that that also applies in general to the early childhood section. So for the AQ application tab, that's going to be your main application narrative section, which includes your needs assessment, project description, and theory of action. The second tab in this section is project objective and activities, which include a SMART project objective and then 3 to 5 activities per reporting period. And it should align with the needs assessment and project description on the previous tab. Next is your budget tab and the sub-tabs by category of expenditure, which is where you'll outline the specific planned expenditures for this grant. And finally, there's a budget amendments tab, which you'll want to leave blank when submitting the original application, but you will complete that when submitting an application amendment in the future if you choose to do that. And that tab replaces our previous requirement of uploading a letter of rationale to explain your budget amendment. Instead, you'll enter that rationale information on the budget amendments tab. All right, so we're going to dive a little bit deeper into the different questions on the academic quality application tab. So first is your needs assessment. So again, the application guide that we've provided this year is your best source of information for checklist and specific items that you need for this section, but just some highlights. You'll want to make sure that all data sources selected in the checklist are used to substantiate a demonstrated need at the LEA, that the specific data points from each source selected are included in the needs assessment narrative. So we're looking for the checklist to match the data sources and data points included in the narrative. And we're also looking to see that data points provided are up to date. So you're not using data from 5 or 6 years ago. We want to see that you've updated your needs assessment each year. Next, the project description section. You'll want to be sure that the project is clearly described, including how the proposed project will meet the needs identified in the needs assessment section. The proposed project should be research-based, based on a history of demonstrated success at the LEA, and/or based on sound reasoning. And project components should be focused and aligned with the needs assessment. Projects may address more than one area of need, but each need must be clearly substantiated by the needs assessment. So we're hoping that projects this year will be focused around specific needs and not kind of a catch-all for various activities going on at the LEA. Next is the theory of action section. You'll want to be sure that the theory of action is presented in the appropriate format, which is if, then, because. So for example, if we do X activity, then we will see Y result because research and evidence shows Z. So that's the general kind of formula or format for the theory of action. It should describe how and why the project will be successful and provide the strategic thinking behind the change the LEA seeks to produce. And the theory of action statement should be based on credible research, a history of demonstrated success at the LEA, or other credible evidence, similar to the project description. And then you'll have the equitable access and participation section. So in this section, you'll want to be sure that the narrative provides detailed and concrete examples of how the LEA, when using grant funds, will ensure equitable access to and participation in grant-funded activities. Subgroups should be clearly named in the narrative. For example, students experiencing homelessness, English learners, or people with disabilities. And the narrative should describe specific strategies that the LEA will use to remove barriers to participation in grant-funded activities. The next tab is the project and objective and activities tab, as I mentioned before. So some reminders for this tab: the project objective should be SMART. So that stands for specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound. So we are looking for each of those components to be met in your project objective. We will send it back if it's not specific or measurable, time-bound in some way. So please do check that your project objective meets all of those components. The project objective should also be clearly aligned with the needs identified in the needs assessment section and the project described in the project description section of the application. Next, you're going to need at least 3 specific activities provided for each of the 2 reporting periods, so a total of 6 activities minimum for the entire award period. And each project activity should include a description of the evidence of completion that the LEA will retain in its files to demonstrate that the activity has been completed. So for instance, that could be professional development sign-in sheets, coaching logs, and observation notes. And we will review that documentation in the event that your LEA is monitored for this grant. So please be thoughtful about the types of evidence that you're including in this section of the application. All right, so moving on to the budget tabs. The first sub-tab on the budget section is salaries and benefits. So in this tab, you'll need for each line item the program category, which is selected from a drop-down menu, the position title that you're funding, so that should be an employee of the LEA, a brief position description, which should demonstrate how the activities conducted by the individual are necessary to meet the purpose or objectives of the grant project. And then you're going to have a cost basis description. So that's your justification for the amount budgeted. So how you arrived at the total that you're budgeting for this salary. It should include the annual salary, fringe benefits rate, percentage of staff time charged to the grant, number of staff in the position. If you have more than one person filling the same role, you can include them on the same line item. And then the time period for reimbursement. If you're only charging partial year, you can specify that here to further justify the amount that you've budgeted. And the cost basis should demonstrate how the amount budgeted is reasonable. So that's how we are using that cost basis description. The remaining tabs, the kind of structure of the line items looks the same. So you'll have the program category, again, selected from a drop-down menu, the items to be purchased. Next is the purpose of those expenditures. So a brief description, 1 to 2 sentences of the purpose of the expenditure in the grant program. And the description must explain why the expenditure is necessary to meet the purpose or objectives of the grant project. And then your cost basis, again, is your justification for the amount budgeted. So for goods, this would include the quantity and estimated cost per unit. And for services, this could include the time period of the contract, for example, hourly rate or months covered, and the scope of the services. So how many grades, students, staff members are served. The cost basis should demonstrate how the amount budgeted is reasonable. And then you'll have the actual amount budgeted that you'll enter into that line item. So again, the early childhood application section for those LEAs that receive an early childhood allocation is going to mirror the academic quality section. So you'll have the main application narrative on the first tab, which includes your needs assessment, project description, and theory of action. You'll again have project objective and activities on the second tab, your budget, and then your budget amendments tab, which should be blank for the original application. So again, some reminders on application submission. You'll want to submit early to ensure time to resolve any technical issues and alert your program contact as soon as possible if you're experiencing any issues. As you complete the application, be sure to save each tab as you go so that you're not losing anything. It's also a good idea for longer narrative sections if you complete your typing outside of the system in a Word document and then copy and paste, but be sure that the copy and paste kind of transfer is complete, that you're not missing any sections when you paste it into the application due to word count or character count limits. Prior to submitting, you'll want to review each tab to ensure you've completed every field that's required. And then you'll return to that main application section from the dropdown, which is the SOAR Formula Consolidated section, and you'll run the consistency check, which locks the application. And then you'll submit. So there's kind of two steps to submitting: the consistency check and then actually submitting. And the application, again, is due at 3 p.m. Eastern Time on November 3rd, and the submit button in eGMS will be disabled after this time. Again, we highly recommend leaving at least a day or two, ideally a week or more, before the deadline to ensure that you're not running into any technical issues with submission. And again, the remaining tabs on the main application section don't require any action, but are available for reference. So the application history tab, you can review to see how many times the application has been submitted or rejected, with timestamps and who initiated each action. So that's where you can kind of follow along with the application as it goes through the evaluation process. And then the application print tab can be used to create a PDF version of the application, either before or after your information is submitted. So sometimes folks like to request a PDF prior to submission just to read through all of their responses one more time. Or you might choose to print a PDF before you begin if you prefer to kind of read a printout or a PDF of the application rather than clicking through all of the tabs. And eGMS only generates PDFs at the top of each hour. So if you submit a request for an application print anytime between 1 and 1:59, for example, the PDF will become available for download around 2:01. So just be mindful of that if you're requesting a PDF print. So applications are reviewed against a standard checklist, which is very similar to the checklist points that were shared throughout this webinar and that are included in the application guide. And that ensures quality of the proposed projects. Reviewers will determine whether there's enough detail provided and whether expenditures are reasonable, necessary, and appropriate. And revisions, if revisions are needed, you'll be given an opportunity to make the necessary changes to receive approval. So there will be a lot of times some back and forth. Again, we're hoping that this application guide and webinar as resources will minimize that back and forth because you'll know what's expected upfront. And finally, our contact information. Again, program contacts are listed in the allocations document, which is linked here. The first 3 individuals listed on this table are the grant specialists working on the SOAR formula grants, and their contact information is provided here. And my contact information is also provided in the event that you need additional support, or if you're unsure who your program contact is, feel free to reach out to me directly by email or phone. And that's all I have for you today, but I saw some questions coming into the chat. So the first question I received was, what percentage of early childhood students will make an LEA eligible for the early childhood grant? So the answer to that is an LEA must serve at least 40% of early childhood students, meaning their total enrollment at the LEA must be at least 40% 3- and 4-year-olds in order to become eligible for the early childhood grant. If you have any questions about that and about your LEA's specific eligibility, feel free to reach out to me directly. Another question, can you please highlight any changes to the academic quality application project narratives from prior years, or are the narrative and budget requirements the same as last year? They are roughly the same. We didn't make any major changes to the project narratives. The budget tabs will look slightly different this year. through an effort to kind of standardize a lot of the federal formula grants that you receive. The budget tabs will look slightly different. So again, you'll have that kind of description for most of the tabs and then a cost basis description, which is new. So be sure again to review these slides and the application guide as you're completing the budget tabs. But generally, the project narratives are the same from prior years. And then another question, what does the needs assessment submission need to look like? So it's going to be an actual narrative in the application. It's not a requirement to upload, or it's not a specific template that you need to complete. You're going to have a checklist of data sources where you can select the different quantitative and qualitative data sources that you're using for the needs assessment. And then there's just a narrative section for the needs assessment where you will provide data points from those data sources to justify the need that you're addressing through this project. So there's no like additional template that you need to complete and upload. It's just a narrative within the application that you can go ahead and view now as the application is already available in eGMS. Hopefully that's helpful. So I'll wait about 5 more minutes for more questions to come in. But if your questions have been answered, then feel free to sign off. And again, this recording will be posted on the SOAR Formula webpage by early next week. And thank you all for joining. Have a great afternoon. The 40% requirement for early childhood students in order to be eligible to receive that allocation is based on the previous school year audited enrollment. And another question, do we need to specify exact monthly pay for cost basis? Can you repeat that one more time? No, we don't necessarily need exact monthly pay. The annual pay would suffice for salaries and benefits. If you are charging less than the full year or the full award period for a specific individual, like if you're only charging them to the grant from September through December, you can specify that. But you don't necessarily need monthly pay. And with that, we are at 1 o'clock, so I'm going to end the session. And again, the recording will be available. Thank you all so much for joining and have a great afternoon.